as Additional Chief Secretary to the Government of India, Madhya Pradesh. He has published short story collections like Tell a Tale and Other Stories, Invisible Poet and Other Stories, The Mysterious Ladies and Other Stories, and much more. In conversation with Mr. P.K. Dash, we have Mr. Diwakar Shukla, a confluence of academics and praxis, with a 2-decade specialization in fields of communication and change. He is the Professor and Dean Faculty of Journalism and Creative Studies, Jagran Lake City University. He says his introduction to stories came from Uncle Sri Lal Shukla, author and Gyanpith Awardee, and his civil servant father, Bhavani Shukla. Our next discussant is Professor Seema Raizada. She is an English professor at Maharani Lakshmi Bai Government Girls Postgraduate College, Bhopal. She is a Shakespeare scholar who has her PhD and other degrees on the works of the Bard and has also authored a book titled The Double Vision of Shakespeare. She is the founder of Club Literate, which is an exclusive platform for both established and budding writers and artists. She also received appreciation for her contribution in fields of literature and youth welfare. I request you dignitaries to please initiate the conversation.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be in conversation with Mr. P.K. Dash and to have as a co-discussant Professor Diwakar Shukla. Personally, I know them as both very creative people. We know Mr. Dash because he's a storyteller, and we also know Professor Diwakar Shukla as a person who can talk about the art of storytelling. Mr. Dash is, he's a prolific writer, and he is also a self-publisher. Coming to even think of the kind of creativity that he brings into his stories is, I think, one must have to read his stories to actually see the kind of, not only the kind of wit, the humor, and the gentle satire that is, that his stories are replete with, but also the kind of life lessons. So that's very, very typical of all the stories that I have come across. Talking about his the books that he has written, Mr. Dash has focused mainly on short stories, and I've also read, besides his short stories, the numerous pieces which are a source of delight and instruction, I would say, and that comes straight from his not only heart but also from his homeland so many times. So initiating the conversation, Mr. Dash, I would like to refer to the epigraph in this book, Tell a Tale and Other Stories, which is by Maya Angelou. And he quotes Maya, "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you." And that's a clear reflection, that basically human beings are they all have stories. We all have stories. But it is, I think, left to the fortunate few, like Mr. Dash, to tell us. And in that process, he has given us so many beautiful stories. My question to you, to begin with, why short stories? Why tell a tale?
Thank you, Seema ji, Professor Diwakar ji, and distinguished audience. A pleasure to chat with you and share a few ideas, thoughts on what particularly my own experience of writing stories and novel and songs, maybe poems. Uh, what with my two distinguished co-discussants, we had thought that we would divide the time available. Uh, they may ask me about the stories I have written, some of the books they have read, and we will talk a little more about the art of storytelling, which would be of general interest, because I presume not many would have read my stories. So what goes into writing a story and what clicks, what doesn't. Before that, before I answer Seemaji's question, let me say that you'd recall several years ago, a lady politician was about to be prime minister. And then a Sardar, fully bearded and turbaned, became our prime minister. Today I am almost in a position like this, because Tinu Disa, our friend, was to be the author, and I was to be here the discussant. So I don't allege that Tinu Disa is feminine and I am a bearded Sardar, but I have got a kind of wild card entry. I was looking to be an humble discussant and ask Disa about his stories. But unfortunately, he is not very well. He is a little ill and could not travel. So that's how I was pushed to be the author, and Seemaji and Professor Diwakar ji would be querying me. So coming to the question, the quote you read from Maya Angelou, you write really when you have no choice but to write. One can write if you are a professional writer, if you have to write edits, you have to write news coverage, articles, pieces. You are a professional. You have been groomed and trained to. But we are here talking about creative writing. What inspires you to take up creative writing? When do you know that you have the creative urge? So Maya makes the point that when you have no choice but to share your story with others. I will come to the writing part a little later. I am really taking you back to the urge to tell a story. Why do we tell story? Why do we share stories? And why do people love to listen to stories? Two things. Somebody has, I think, Richard Gongshell, if I am not mistaken. It might be somewhere in my, but I will not run the PPT. I recall most of the thing. He said that Homo sapiens can possibly be better described as Homo fictus, the storytelling man. And I would link it to, you might have read Yuval Noah Harari, the trilogy, the wonderful retelling of history in a way that captivates the imagination and asks serious questions. Harari has made a point in his 2021 book that human civilization is what it is because of the power of storytelling. The creation of myths. He says Homo sapiens are myth makers. We have created myths. That's how the civilization grew. And he has given this example. In a typical, think of the long past when there was rudimentary civilization, the hunting gathering. At that time, he has said that the maximum number of persons who can be in a close kinship group is 150. 150 to 250. Beyond that, it is impossible to communicate and impossible to force the common will. There has to be a Sardar, there has to be a headman, and they have to tell you something, how we organize ourselves. So Harari has made this point that only when men learn to tell stories, share stories, and spread stories, that's how man invented the art of communicating beyond the immediate geography. He has said religion is a myth, God is a myth, money is a myth. Money is really a myth. Whether a coin or a note or even the digital currency, it's a myth. We have been told that this is how we are in agreement that we will use this as a medium of exchange. That's how it's a myth. It has no intrinsic value. Money has no intrinsic value, whether US dollar, paper. So these two things, I think, kind of explain why stories are important. Man is homo fictus. If we experience something, we have an urge to share it with others. That's why our grandmas told stories, and that's why our Puranas and everywhere. In all civilizations, as far as you can go, even before the written word or script was there, storytelling was universal. And why it was popular? Because people have been sharing values, developing systems, and that's why storytelling is civilizational and foundational. And why we tell stories? Because as human beings, we are social animals, and we bond with each other by telling stories.
Thank you so much for actually taking us back into the process of how Homo sapiens are termed as Homo fictus. One thing that brings me to my next question to you. When we write stories, you have certain a bank of ideas with you. And as I see in your stories, your native village, the state of Odisha, they form a beautiful part of not only the storytelling, the makeup of your characters, the landscape, and certain traits that are very typical of that state. So, was that a kind of a choice, or what came before, Odisha or the characters and the landscape in your stories?
Thank you for asking that. That's really, I recall Amartya Sen in his autobiography. He has written that when people ask me, you teach in Harvard, you are also an Oxford professor, and you also go to India, he has written a beautiful piece. He says, which is my identity? Just because I have a home in Boston, or I have a home in London, and I have a home in Santiniketan. Actually, when I visited Santiniketan 5 years ago, I went to see Amartya Sen in a very small, modest bungalow. His maternal grandfather was there, a great Sanskrit. So he has written, if you have not read Amartya Sen's autobiography, please read. It's eminently readable and you would enjoy it. It's available on Kindle and physical copy. There he has said, which is my identity? When people ask me, I really don't know how to fill that question. Am I a professor teaching in Harvard? Was I a scholar? Am I a Nobel laureate? Am I an Indian? Which is my identity? Am I an Indologist? Because I love India and Indian culture. He says, all of us, irrespective of how eminent or how humble you are, we have multiple identities. So do we have to take a call that this is my primary identity? So he has said, when in the family context, I am a father, grandfather, I was a son, I was a grandson, I am a husband. In the social context, I am X, Y, and Z. In the academic world, I am this. So that tells us. So Seema ji, I grew up in Odisha. So that is a part of me. It is in there. I know more about Odisha, and possibly childhood memories are more permanent, and it has shaped you in a way that is impossible to walk out of. So I actually ask myself the question, who am I? I left Odisha 40 years ago. So the first maybe 25 years of my life I was there. But I have spent now 45 years here. So am I a North Indian now? A Madhya Pradeshi? I taught for some time and then I joined the civil service. So what is my identity? Am I a teacher? Am I a civil servant, bureaucrat? So when I write, I don't really have to bother about which identity would be uppermost. I do not consciously say that I would write about Odisha. Several of my stories are autobiographical or semi-autobiographical. That's why you have read a lot of stories where my village is the backdrop. My childhood friends, my school friends are, and I have written a full book, Kathapur Tales. Kathapur Tales I have designed, I don't see that here, possibly they could not pick it. Kathapur Tales is the autobiography of my village. It could be my own autobiography also, but I have written it in third person to achieve the emotional distance. I want to tell the tale of my village. What was the village? Who were the people who were interesting? What things I visualized when I was a child? So I find it very interesting and engrossing. And believe you, Seema ji, these things in some of my manuscripts, I have had this habit of keeping a diary and a notebook. And since my early days, I have been jotting down a paragraph, 2 paragraphs, a full article. And I have written about some of these stories maybe 30 years ago. And I retrieved it from a... So, which identity is mine? It depends on the moment. What am I writing about? If I am writing about the current context, I am a concerned Indian citizen. I think I worry about my country sometimes, and I get agitated. Sometimes I am thrilled because my country is doing so well. When people are charitable, kind and generous, as we saw many people during COVID times, it thrills the heart. And when people are mean and idiotic, it hurts us. So the author's identity is, I can speak about myself. I never really worry or think that this is the identity I will project. It is the story which guides me what to put in that story. When I try to write a story, I try to think of the reader. Will it be interesting to the reader? Will we tell something? If I tell of my story of my small little village in Odisha, how would you relate to it? Is there some universal idea, theme that you can also relate to? That's what I worry about as an author.
So one observation before I hand over to Professor Diwakar. I find in his stories, his stories, as he just mentioned, they're full of very, the kind of the color that he gives to the entire setting of the story. For example, one of the stories, you talk about, I think your cousin learning to swim, where you were punished probably. Then he also mentions his pet name, probably, and then he talks about the probationer or training period of, as a bank officer, where some friends were staying, and the haunted house. So there are several points in his writing where we know that he is taking us, to a point sometime, in his, in his fine recollection of those moments. So thanks for giving us the pleasure of experiencing those moments as you write. So Professor Diwakar, now it's you to talk about the art of his storytelling.
Yeah, I think excellent, because thank you, Seema ji, because, thank you so much, Sandash, because you brought in such a earthy feel to everything. And I think the essence of, from my perspective, the essence of writing stories is when you can relate to it for a reader or for the writer. And whatever we do in our life, we end up spinning yarns around it. We kind of create images in our conversations. We end up getting characters in our conversations and pieces, and also then provide purpose and kind of a distinctive DNA to our characters as well. In that context, and if, as you said rightly, sir, if the stories are so integral to us, part of our DNA, and as many people have said that as human beings, we are wired to tell stories and listen to stories. If that is a context, sir, why is it that only few people are able to shoulder this responsibility? The few people are able to actually, take this burden forward and write a story. So is there I think it's not just about that human beings who are able to tell stories and enjoy stories, but then everybody should be writing a story and coming out with the books and so many interesting anecdotes that you have shared. But why is it that only few people are able to really shoulder this particular responsibility?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Why do, actually not very few people write. Now I find that a lot of people write. If you know about every year, 4 lakh new titles are published. I did a little Google search, and 4 lakh new titles, and then I queried Google, how many total books are there in the world at this point? It listed in 2016, there were some 48 lakh books. So then, I'm just going off the tangent, let me finish that. How many books would an average reader get to read in her entire life? How many? 720. Somebody has made a calculation. Let us say first 21 years they are in college and they are studying their syllabus and all that. But after you are free from your prescribed syllabus, let us say you read approximately 1 book a month, 12 books a year. So he has calculated that by 70, presuming that we have a lifespan of 70, that's 720 if you have read, you are a well-read person. So look at the universe of available books, 48 lakhs. Okay, let us cut out the technical books. I don't want to read technical books and engineering which Parsuramji would be reading, or difficult, and I read fiction, literature and non-fiction of general interest to me. So, how many books shall I get to read in my entire life? That's why we have to be very choosy about what we read. Think twice before picking up any of my titles. You might be missing out on many more things that you have in your reading list. Read, but everybody should read. I forgot the question. The question is that why the few people are Yeah. So I gave the counter argument, but more people read, I would like to believe, than people who write. Because again, coming back to that, everybody is full of stories. There is no person who is devoid of stories. Some people say, अरे मेरा जीवन तो क्या है, इतना ordinary है, what shall I write about it? क्या कहने का क्या है? It is so common, ordinary, mundane, and ऐसा नहीं है. If you really sit back, take a notebook or a scrap of paper and start writing a little, you find that you are capable of writing stories. You have, everybody is a repository of stories. I would not think of any person, even an unlettered person, जो totally illiterate हैं, they are full of stories. Because life cannot happen without stories. Everybody has stories. Somebody has said, stories are us. वो हमारा ही कहानी है, हम उसको कैरेक्टर देते हैं, हम उसको थर्ड पर्सन लिख सकते हैं, हम उसको नॉन ऑटोबायोग्राफिकल कर सकते हैं, हम टोटली फिक्शनल भी कर सकते हैं. Let us say we write entirely fictional stories, Harry Potter and The Hobbit and Lord of Rings. Even if you are writing entirely fictional stories, including our own Puranas, Hanuman flying with the mountains across the skies. So, we know that these are fictions, but they do appeal to us at some deeper level. The stories do have some appeal which is unencumbered by the props, the characters and the superficial and the supernatural. So, everybody has stories in them, but why do few people write? Because people don't try to, it is a lot of work. Writing a story, because when you are writing a story, you have to worry about the other. Who will read it and why will they read it, and will it appeal to them? These are the questions you have to ask when you assume you hope to be a writer. As soon as you start putting pen to paper, you have to answer these questions. If what I write is trash or uninteresting, even I don't like to read what I have written, then who else will read it? Does it appeal to you? The third thing, it is not merely that you have a story, you want to tell, you want to try. Do you have the craft? You have to have a language and a tool. What is our tool? Either by word of mouth, if you want to have an oral story, if you know a good story in your friend circle, you might share it and people like it. The same story I might try to share and I may fall flat. We have the art of telling a story. Exactly the same story, your friends can be delighted. Same story, if I am not a good storyteller, if I do not know how to communicate with the audience, it will fall flat. आप jokes के बारे में देखिए. The most wonderful jokes can be killed by a person who does not know how to tell jokes. So, it's nothing. Some people have the innate gift of sharing stories in a very interesting way. In our life, we have met several of these people. Somebody who tells a good joke, somebody who narrates a small story. It might be a bite-sized story, but you find that, oh, he tells wonderful stories. We know such people in our lives. When we are talking of writing, as I would like to underline, writing is only one medium. I can tell a story purely through sketches. If I am a good sketch artist, I can just sketch without any word. A story can be told. We know, we read these cartoons and animation. We can paint and tell a story. A painting can tell a very big story. But when we are talking of the medium of language, you have to choose a language. If you are good in Hindi, if you are good in your own vernacular, you pick up which language you are able to express yourself well. The language of your choice, I suggest, should be the language where you are most comfortable and you are able to communicate what you want to tell. So ultimately, people do not write because they are hesitant. अरे मेरा स्टोरी में तो कोई दम नहीं है, कुछ भी खास नहीं हुआ मेरा जीवन में, ये ऑर्डिनरी चीजें क्यों लिखेंगे. दूसरा, मुझे लिखना नहीं आता, इतना मेहनत कौन करेगा कि एक स्टोरी को 10 बार लिखो, एडिट करो और फिर उसको टाइप करो और फिर कहीं कौन इसको प्रिंट करेगा. ये all these questions are there, and all these questions are even currently there. Suppose I write a lot of stories and books, but who will print it and who will read it? how shall I get across to a larger audience? That's the question. That is marketing, like Professor Diwakar, how to create a brand image, how to market your story, how to put it across to a lot of people. So why people don't write more stories is because there are real handicaps and bottlenecks. You have to address that, and you have to work at it to be able to write and put it across.
So, Mr. Dash, this is the reference to Hanuman. He just made a reference to Hanuman, and there's a lovely story where he has titled it Hanuman and the tea bill. Now, this is something which I would like to highlight here. This is what he said. When you say you have nothing to write, but there is so many ways a story can be written. Now, Hanuman is just coming straight from Ramayana, and tea bill. I mean, you cannot imagine the connection between the two. But he makes that connection in his story and brings it to a real world, a contemporary world, and also brings in his experiences of an office working, the kind of establishment, calling it the establishment office of Shri Ram, and giving it all, the disciplinary inquiry, etc. And it's beautiful. I'm tempted to read, Professor Shukla, I'll just read a few lines. When the TA bill, I mean, Hanumanji going to get Sanjeevani, and he travels all the way, and then he submits his TA bill. And the person in the office, he brings it to Lord Rama, and he refuses to forward that. I'm not going to forward this TA bill. So the conversation goes on. He says, "Your Lordship, just like Hanuman, I am also your most obedient servant," etc. And then Rama says, "Could you please enlighten me as to why TA rules of the kingdom of Ayodhya disallow TA and DA for a journey ordered by me?" So the officer replies that, "Your Majesty, is one of the objections. Everyone knows that Hanuman performed the journey in compliance of your orders, but there is no documentary proof thereof. Hanuman was in a tearing hurry to fly off on this long trip to a hill station. He omitted to obtain your written approval prior to commencement of his journey." And the conversation is goes on, and there are two things. First, he flew. I mean, and then where are the bills? He cannot, of course, get the bills. And secondly, this is also, as I pointed out earlier, that he tries to leave a message. I mean, Hanuman lifted the entire mountain instead of bringing only one herb. So in that process, he is damaging the environment. So he's left, with that warning that from there on, he's not going to do this. This time it's okay, will pass. So just to carry forward the idea that how a story is made up and from where it can come and any connections can be brought. Yes, so, Professor Shukla.
Very interesting because...
may I add just one sentence? This Hanuman's TA bill, I have written it as a satire on bureaucracy. It's a satire on bureaucracy, the kind of legalese and the kind of mindset we have in saying no first. Any bill comes, first say no and 10 objections. And it can ultimately be resolved through various methods. I have tried to write this satire, and this is not an original story. My director, when I was in Delhi in the Ministry of Commerce, my director and we were on a travel. And my director, a young officer from the railway service, he told this joke. It was a 2-minute joke, 2 or 3-minute joke. The substance of the joke was that Hanuman presented his TA bill, the accountant put up several objections, Ram got angry, and then how Ram said, "I don't know anything, you have to pass this bill." So he said, "Okay, I am preparing a note sheet to waive all the objections and all that." So I developed it as a full satire on bureaucracy. It is a satire on ourselves, and I greatly enjoyed it. I hope you might, all my readers who have read it greatly enjoyed it. And so far I have received no threats from Ram Bhakt, so I have apologized. I mean no, and I have given a disclaimer. I mean no offense to Lord Ram, हम भी भक्त हैं और हनुमान जी का भी हम हनुमान चालीसा पढ़ते हैं, लेकिन ये सटायर हमारे बारे में है, तो आप गाली मत दीजिएगा.
Interesting, because when sir you were speaking, what came to my mind, and I think very rightly said by Seema ma'am and you, uh, when I was in my school days, and this is a personal anecdote, but I think it just sprung in my head is because this is exactly what they were saying. So I asked my uncle, one of my uncles, how do you write so well? I also want to become a writer. And I belong to Lucknow. So from Lucknow, about 25, 30 kilometers away is our village. And so he asked me, how many times do you actually go to the village? I said, once in a year, like a picnic during winters. And then he said, how good you think you are when you observe things around you. So I was flummoxed because I said, as a writer, my uncle should be giving me some tips, something which Mr. Dash very rightly said it, the language, tips, felicity of expression. So he said, how good you are at observing things, and how good you are in connecting the dots. And I think I did not, to be honest, at that point of time, I could not connect these things together. Years later, when I met so many people, and there are so many people sitting out there, I realized what he actually meant. And in one of his books, he ends up writing, because he talked about Hanumanji's TA and his anecdotes, and there will be many civil servants and former civil servants here, so no disrespect to them. In his book, he writes कि एक सरकारी ऑफिसर का ट्रिप जो होता है या सरकारी दौरा जो होता है, वो जिस तरफ पलंग के उठता है, उस डायरेक्शन में अपने इस डिस्ट्रिक्ट में निकल जाता है, एक डिस्ट्रिक्ट कलेक्टर. So it was a satirical thing which he had talked about then. Now, if we come back and relate it back to the storytelling part of it, which Mr. Dash very rightly said it, and many of you would know about it, Antonio Damasio is one of the foremost psychologists. And years back, he had done some experiments, and he had said that as human beings, we are not thinking machines. We are feeling machines who think. So if this is true, scientifically true, neuroscientifically true, then I think it is imperative for us to get the emotions and connects very, very well. Because we end up giving logic and rational everything. And then we realize that eventually what sticks in reader's mind is the emotions. It's the connects that you get it. Like some in your books, because I think that's important according to me. So any views you have, sir?
Sure. Let me add two more things. In the previous response, please, I must disabuse the audience. If I might have sounded discouraging, please excuse me. Anybody really can be a writer. What I was trying to tell is that you have to apply. You have to try, and you have to try again. Somebody famously said, if you really want to be a short story writer, and if you really want to work at it, try to write one story a week. It would be impossible for you to write 52 very bad stories in a year. At least one or two would be good. That's an amazingly encouraging work. He said, if you try, you will learn the art. Let me also say something interesting, something if I had the liberty to choose the topic for today's discussion, I would have possibly talked about artificial intelligence and literature. You might have read in the papers, it has recently come. There is a new artificial intelligence tool called character.ai. So again, I love to explore, so I signed up for character.ai. And would you believe that this morning, for my preparation for this session, I asked the same question. How to write a great story? I asked 4 persons: William Shakespeare, Albert Camus, J.R.R. Tolkien, and the story maker. Story maker is basically the computer itself. When I popped this question, this tool has that ability to tell you what Shakespeare's works would guide you about storytelling. And although I had not been able to put it in this slide, but would you believe that I can chat with Shakespeare when I asked him, which is your most famous sonnet, he said sonnet 116, and these are the few lines. That's as quickly as. And so when I asked this question, how to write a great story, all the four persons had significantly different counsel to offer. Shakespeare said, put in a lot of details, there should be dramatic ending, and you must develop your characters well. J.R.R. Tolkien says, feel free to borrow from existing themes and myths and stories. There are millions of very popular stories. Give it a twist. Look at J.R.R. Tolkien, The Hobbit and The Lord of Rings, and the fabulous films that have been made on it. So that then I asked Albert Camus, The Plague, and he won the Nobel in 1957 at the age of 44. Albert Camus. Phenomenal short novels. It is slightly bigger than a short story, but amazing books. So Camus says that don't be hesitant about putting your autobiographical things, because we cannot escape talking about ourselves, and all our experience is our own. And how can you write something devoid of that? So anybody who claims that I do not write autobiographical stuff is not telling the truth. I am what I am because I have grown, I have gathered experience, I have interacted with people, and I have lived a life. It is unlike anybody else. You have not led that life. You have not. No, we are unique. Each of us have led a life which is unique and not replicable. The same kind of life nobody, even your own brother, sister, or even your twin would not have lived that. So the story you can tell, nobody else can tell. That is the unique signature. Once you start writing, so the uncertainty, if you are talking about the audience response, I would counsel, don't worry about what the audience would. They may or may not like. There are billions of people in this world, and I bet not many people will read you. But why should you concern? Have you been able to tell a good story? Have you worked hard enough to give it a shape? And are you at the end of your second, third, fourth or 10th revision, are you happy about that? Do you honestly feel that, yes, I cannot do any better. This is the best I can. So try that. And the last one, I would end this uncertainty thing. If you try, you might become a good writer. But if you never begin, how would you ever? So put pen to your paper and begin writing. And if you are fond of keying it on your laptop or desktop right away, or even on your smartphone, do write. And how long should it be? A short story can be very short indeed. You have heard of the shortest short story in the world. Let me, in my preface, I have made this. Let me repeat it for those who might not have heard. This, somebody, a professor took a whole course, a semester, on the art of storytelling. At the end of his class, he said, now, boys and girls, who can give me a story where the elements of religion, sex, surprise, climax, and royalty would be there? So someone stood up and said, oh my God, the queen is pregnant. Who did it? That was it. One of the shortest short stories. So it involves religion, royalty, and clandestine activity, and surprise, climax. And so that's the, how long can actually I have seen, I'm forgetting her name, a leading current American short storyteller, she has carved out a niche for writing extremely micro stories, something which is just 100 words, no characters, he and she. She does not give a name to the character also. So it is possible to write those kind of stories that tell something, that speaks to us. That's why we enjoy these stories.
So even your stories, I find, Mr. Dash's stories, some of them are pretty, short in length. I mean, the first one, especially.
One
yeah.
minute read, 2 minute
Yes.
read, 3 minute. Actually, long years ago, I was writing newspaper middles, Times of India and Indian Express. They had a 500-word limit. So I kind of cultivated the habit of trying to be extremely brief, concise, to the point, and remove all the
And
verbiage.
not forgetting the punch that comes in the last line. I mean, he's absolutely marvelous at giving that punch. I mean, even in the first story, if you read, that comes as not only a surprise, in many others, it comes as the last line. I mean, he keeps the reader waiting to be there at the end with him to, and enjoy the end of the story. Not only the story, but then you looking back at the story, going back to the story, understanding in, in a fuller way. So, yes.
Also, ma'am, one of the things, and I think you very...
Our time is...
Give me 30 seconds more. So just to kind of, bring it, because I think it's a very pertinent point which Mr. Dash provided. And I think, if we are discussing a sense of how to write a story or the art of writing a story or whatever it could be, I think what I get out of what he said correctly is that everybody has a story, because he started the entire conversation around it. Now, if everybody has a story, and then he also said that, often people who have stories do not put their pen to paper or start writing or typing it down. And we kind of have a sense of a fear of failure, as we often saw it. Who's going to read my story? Now, we often end and forget that as humans, if we are wired to tell stories and listen to stories, we also have human truths. We also have universal stories, the human emotions. And I was telling somebody in one of our classes, I said, if you have a story of a mother to be told to the world, let me do it in Bhopal, let me do it in Odisha, let me do it in London, let me do it in Brazil, anywhere. At the end of it, and you give that particular story to anybody in the world, the emotions with the mom or the mother comes out in whichever language they're talking, it relates to it. So I think the lesson which he very rightly said it, and his stories, I mean, I am amazed because I read some of the stories. The bureaucrat Raymond is outstanding. The North Block and the South Block. So I think there are a lot of lessons which he said. He may not have said it in the full sense of giving tips, but I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned if you want to tell a story or write a story, and nobody is a perfect person. But I think that it's the imperfections which actually make their stories real, right? Because the art of storytelling, and as Mr. Das said, is having simplicity, the connect, the concreteness, and also, can we put a human face to non-living things, anthropomorphism, which we call it. How can you, I mean, if you allow me, how do you put a face to a wind? Has anybody ever seen a wind? No, we have not seen, but we have felt it. So I think stories in that format makes a huge sense. And I would also go back, sir, to see that AI thing and how the stories are
and
working.
also the face of a ghost.
Face of a ghost.
He is very fond of telling horror stories as well.
Tino Disa, our very good friend, an excellent teller of stories, who was to tell us about his way of story writing. I received a good compliment about my ghost story, which is in this, which is a real one, and autobiographical, you could say. Tino Dusa's compliment was that I read it about midnight, and I was kind of very afraid. Your storytelling is so scary. I really felt a little scared. I will end with one thing I could not tell earlier. A story is not a constant or a fixed thing. The story I have written, or the stories I have written, when you read it, you get different versions of the story. Nobody reads the same story. The story, I might have put it in the words that I like, and that is a frozen thing in the Kindle or. But what you read is what your life experience is. You interpret the story. You interpret the novel. You interpret a poem. So to that extent, the author is only one half of the transaction. The transaction gets completed when somebody reads it. You are co-creator. Every reader is a co-creator. Unless you really enjoy the story and put yourself into it, the story has failed. So that is, those of you who are aspiring writers, want to be writers, please go ahead, take a notebook. I write in a A4 size notebook before I transfer it to the laptop. And you would be surprised, once you start writing, you would be surprised at the unrush of your memories and experiences, and begin small. Don't try to write like Tolkien or Shakespeare to begin with. Try, be humble and modest, and you would find that if you have the creative urge and want to apply it, you might really be a good writer, and readers might enjoy your story.
And you can always take help of his How to Become an Author in 7 Days. He has written a book. That's another good
and
book.
Thank you, Seema ji and Professor Diwakar. Excellent. They have at very short notice read my stories. Of course, Seema ji has read some of my stories earlier, but Professor Diwakar read in the last 3 days. I am grateful to you for your very perceptive questions and points made. I really enjoyed doing this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dash.
Are there any questions?
Yes, any question?
Yeah, if you have the time and
Another 2-3 minutes. Ask.
yeah, because we should not encroach upon others.
Yes.
Who is your favorite Indian author and your favorite foreign author? And a short story.
Ruskin Bond, Manoj Das. Two of my amazingly, and in Hindi, Premchand, and in Hindi and vernacular, many. But in English, Ruskin Bond and these.
And from the foreign author?
Almost all the Chekhov, Anton Chekhov, Somerset Maugham, O. Henry, all the good storytellers. I studied literature, so in a way I was forced to read, but I enjoyed.
Anyone from Madhya Pradesh?
Madhya Pradesh, I read Srilal Shuklaji's Rag Darwari. मध्य प्रदेश के हो कि कहीं के हो, हमारे भारत के हैं. भारत के राग दरबारी, अमेजिंग बुक. आई रेड 30 years ago. आप मुझे I am delighted to know that Professor Diwakar Shukla is his cousin. Wonderful. There are many amazing. Unfortunately, other languages में जो है हम translation नहीं पा पाते हैं. We really miss out on the wonderful work. So I really try to read as many Indian authors as possible. Now, जो language मैं जानता हूँ, ओडिया जानता हूँ, हिंदी जानता हूँ, वो डायरेक्ट पढ़ता हूँ. बाकी ट्रांसलेशन पढ़ने की कोशिश. बहुत बढ़िया. देखिए, सिलेबस में जो है वो तो पढ़िए ही, लेकिन सिलेबस के बाहर जब पढ़ाई खत्म हो गया तब अपने मन से पढ़िए, जो अच्छा लगता है पढ़िए.
Yes, we can take one more question. Yes. Can we? One more question. Yes.
I do write poems, like to tell stories. So I want to be a writer. So at what time of like your life or like your writing journey you would realize that you book?
My daughter published her book in January 2020, which Raghav Chandra, our friend, gave her the opportunity to launch that book. When she published the book, I felt very jealous. I said, you have published this book, and she took 1 year sabbatical. She quit her job, 1 year sabbatical. She said, by the end of the year, I'll publish a collection of short stories. She did, and Raghav gave her the platform. She released the book. Um, when that happened, I promised to her within 6 months I will publish 2 books. And I did by June 2020. And as Seema ji told, I am a self-published author. I really did not go to any publisher. I said I cannot wait, considering my age and COVID looming. I said I am not willing to wait for a publisher to take 6 months to. I learned how to self-publish. I learned how to self-publish. All my 11 books are self-published. And I have written a book about it, how to be an author in 7 days. My prescription is that I have tried to make it as easy and comprehensible. If you read that book, you really can be, but you have to have the material to publish. If you are writing poems and stories, please read that book and feel free to connect with me. I would be happy to guide also. You can publish in really 3 days' time.
Thank you so much. Now, I would request the President of Society for Culture and Environment, Sri Raghav Chandra, to please come forward and felicitate our guests with a memento as a symbol of love, respect, and gratitude.
That bird. Yeah, amazing, amazing. I saw it in the first session. Thank you very much. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you. All 3 of us enjoyed chatting with our guests.
Okay, quick question, please, for the audience.
Our question is, the Tamil author who wrote the famous historical fiction on which the movie PS1 or the Ponniyin Selvan is based. Anyone?